We're here at the Henry Moore Institute in Leeds talking to Rebecca Fortnum about her exhibition Les Plasticiennes. You're actually a painter and your work here is paintings and drawings, but it's all referring to women sculptors who were in the network of Rodin. Why this interest in sculpture?
Both my parents were and are sculptors, so I guess I grew up around sculpture. I probably need to define myself as something other than a sculptor, but retained an interest in sculpture, and I've been making paintings from sculptures for a while. And it was very much about that museum encounter, when you walk into a museum anywhere in the world and you encounter a sort of sculptural head, and you wonder who that person was, and why the head was made and what they were like. So all that sense, I think, of encountering someone else through history. It's very direct in sculpture because it's there right in front of you.
So what was it that this time made you want to focus on women sculptors and specifically in Rodin's?
I got interested through just looking at sculpture. I got interested in an artist, Jules Dalou, who a French sculptor and sort of slightly, well, a contemporary of Rodin's. And then I'd come across some really marvellous Rodin sculptures that I worked from, and some Camille Claudel. And then I thought that it really needed further investigation. Reading about Claudel's life led me into all these other lives. So I undertook a research fellowship here at the Henry Moore, which allowed me to delve a little deeper and to really concentrate on finding out about the lives and the work of, I think I ended up with about 14 women. And I really feel like I've scratched the surface because they've all just got these amazing lives. Some of them you can find out more about than others because there's more information has survived the test of time. Their whole lives, their work, their attitudes, their interests, their relationships, it's just all endlessly fascinating to me.
I mean, Claudel obviously had a tragic life, and depending on which version you believe, Rodin was at the core of that. Is that the case for all of these women?
I guess I need to do some more research, but from what I've read, I think Rodin had a bit of a bad press. He certainly took Claudel seriously as an artist, and it does feel that there is more to be said about that relationship. I mean, it's given that Rodin was the master, that people came to him for advice, for tutelage, and that he was, respected as the groundbreaking artist he was. And it's also true that women at that time weren't really taken seriously in any professional sphere, right? Yeah. So within those boundaries, I think it's, all the relationships are different. It's absolutely fascinating to think about the times when partners gave support as well as sort of hindrance. Yeah. And I think that's probably just as frequent as the other way around. And it's also interesting to think how the women supported each other. So there is, in my mind at least, and you have to understand that when I'm reading these stories, I'm filling in a lot with a kind of imagined history of them. But a lot of them knew each other and a lot of them worked together. And there is a sense in some situations of a bit of camaraderie amongst these women, and definitely friendship, very long-lasting, significant friendships that are central to their creative and aesthetic outlook as well. So women were talking to women about art. It wasn't just moaning about their situation, Yeah. And these women were pioneers, so they just kind of rolled their sleeves up and got on with it. So their stories are very inspiring.
And how many of them did you know of beforehand? How many were new discoveries through the research?
All of them were new except for Camille
Claudel.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's amazing how their stories have just disappeared.
Yes. And I could have picked another 15. I mean, there are There are a lot of women who were associated. Oh, actually, I should say Sarah Bernhardt. I had heard of her,
course.
but I hadn't heard that she was a sculptor.
No.
And I only knew that she was a sculptor because I was in the Metropolitan Museum in New York about 5 years ago and came across, actually, that one right at the top there. That's the portrait of her husband after he died, the funerary portrait. And then I realised that she was a sculptor and went off to investigate. So yes, there's a few of these that I've actually seen in the flesh, and that sent me on my journey. And then most of them I've just seen in archival photographs, and a lot of the sculpture doesn't exist.
Because it was destroyed?
Yes, possibly, or because it's in a private collection and there's no public record of it. So there's two series of works, series of drawings that are of women's sculptures of men.
Which are behind you.
Which are behind me, yeah. And then there's a series of much smaller paintings that are of portraits of women. There's one self-portrait actually, but and it's all of women that are looking down and looking away. And I suppose one of the important things to say is that these are not a painting of the sculpture. They're a painting of my imagining of the person that the sculpture was of. So all these sculptures are monochrome, they're terracotta or they're marble. And so I'm trying to bring them back to life to an extent by painting them in flesh-like tones. I don't think they ever really look living, but they're kind of sort of hovering a little bit between a kind of static inert matter and then some kind of living, breathing flesh.
Would you say you've got a consistent style throughout all of them, or were you sort of altering that slightly to represent something about the subject?
That's a really good question. I don't think there is that much consistency. And I think that I'm always making a painting that seems to be a kind of one-off thing. But then having done all these as a series, I don't quite know. I don't think it looks like there's a kind of style. Or from the inside it doesn't anyway, or that style shifts slightly from work to work, because I do feel like I'm responding to the actual work, I'm responding to how much information I've got in front of me. And I also think it makes a difference if I've seen the work or not. Yeah. Because if I've seen the work, then I've got a memory of what it was like to encounter it at that moment. So I think all those things come to bear when I'm making the paintings. You would think that learning about the biographies of these artists would sort of somehow reduce your artistic license. But in many ways, the more I know, the more I want to know, and the more there is to know. For every so-called fact, there's a million unanswered questions. So one does read imaginatively, and as an artist, I think that's something I really enjoy. That possibility to enter something and to take your own stories to it. I'm a writer as well as an artist, so I have been writing some texts based in those artists' voice. So trying to sort of read everything about them. Some of them have helpfully written autobiographies, so I feel I can get their voice, and I've read the letters of some of them. And so those things sort of come together for me to sort of try and inhabit them and write a little speech about their view of the world and their struggles with their work, their approach to sculpture, and also their relationships and how they navigated them.
And what will happen with those texts?
Well, I'm hoping that I'll get them performed at some stage.
Oh, fabulous.
And ultimately, I'd quite like to make them into a little play. I think that's a bit of a way off. I thought I might be able to do it by now, but I also have a day job, which is, I work in an art school. So I haven't got as far as I'd like to, but I feel there's so much in there. And I feel like there's so much important for women at this moment to realise, the kind of struggles and the encounters and the difficulties and how you're torn between your family and your work, and between how to approach your work and how to relate to other artists. All that stuff that artists encounter now, they were encountering then. So I do feel it's important to recognise, and also, it's revisionist art history to an extent. Yeah. There are, as we know, many artists that have been, usually women, that have been left out of history, that were very successful at the time. And so some of it is trying to just bring those artists back. And if you haven't got the work, it's a bit difficult. In the past, when I showed these portraits, I've paired them with a kind of abstract decorative panel that goes alongside it. And I think for me there was something about the portrait that doesn't look back, so the portrait where the eyes are averted or even closed, that I found very interesting, because it's a sense of interiority you get from the subject. So they're in their own world, they're dreaming, they're sleeping, they're thinking. Sometimes they're reading, actually, because they are looking down with a book in hand. And so there was a kind of refusal there of the gaze, of the viewer's gaze. So you were looking at a portrait that wasn't looking back for you. And I paired that with these abstract panels because, which have very pronounced symmetry. As a child, you look at patterned wallpaper and you see faces in it. And when you've got these symmetrical things, you can almost see eyes looking back at you. So there's a sense in which, and with symmetry, I think your eye travels around because it wants to see where the pattern starts and ends and what that relationship is with the symmetry. So for me, there was a sense in which the portrait that you would expect to look back at you doesn't, but the abstract painting that you might not expect to look back at you does look back at you. So that was the idea with the other panel. So when I decided to put it on the wallpaper, I thought I'm still going to have that presence there of these sort of the eyes in the wallpaper that might be looking back at you. So this is Pot of a Nose maquette sculpture of Sarah Bernhardt. I don't know, and I don't think it was ever made as a full-size piece, so it's just a matter of inches. But it's lost. Its whereabouts are unknown. When you look at the photograph of it, it's an old black and white photograph. You just kind of see where the thumbprint's in and where the clay has been shaped by the hand. And I think one of the things that interested me about it was because it's a maquette, the features of the face aren't fully realised, and so one's reliant on thinking about the gesture of the figure. So the way this sort of rather strange hand leans against the cheek, or the other hand's on the hip. And I think, Sarah Bernhardt was known as being this incredibly expressive actress that brought audiences to their knees, with an emotional response. So I quite like the way that that's been reduced through the face being absent, but also this need for the gesture of the figure to convey the emotions of the piece.
Does that link in any way with the fact that you chose to do the sculptures where the women had their eyes downcast?
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that, but I think that's probably one of the things that drew me to it. So I think the idea of the women with their eyes downcast means that they're ripe for projection. People project onto other people their own feelings and thoughts and who they think they are, and this happens to women all the time. And so I think there's a sense in which the face then becomes this kind of screen that sort of is projected upon. So I'm quite interested in that, but at the same time, it not being something that overtakes the subject. The subject has its own sort of coherence and interiority that you feel this kind of the strength of the figure. So there's also a kind of rejection of that, but a very quiet rejection of that projection. So there's something very exciting about drawing matter that may not be fully formed. You get that sense with Rodin's beard. You know, this is Claudel getting in there and sort of physically manipulating the material. And so I think there's something about drawing that physicality. I think that's Karl Marx up there. So that's Golubkina's Karl Marx. So particularly with the beards, you get this real strong sense of modelling. And then with the Bernhardt, it's a carving, very, very beautiful marble carving. And I suppose I thought a lot about the process of her making it as I was drawing, because the drawing take quite a long time. Yeah. And so as you're doing the drawing, you're thinking about the materiality of the thing that you're drawing. And the that portrait is of her husband. She'd fallen in love with this young, beautiful man who was several years her junior. Sarah Bernhardt always got everything Sarah Bernhardt wanted. So she married him. You know, he became an actor. Didn't go so well. He was a drug user. He took an overdose. She tried to nurse him, and then he died. And so I thought, what an extraordinary thing to do, to nurse someone till they die and then to carve out of marble their portrait, because that's again not a slow process, not a fast process, is it? It's quite a slow thing that you would do, and it seemed to me that maybe it was this kind of sense of mourning, but also because they had a very conflicted relationship, a kind of triumph. You know, I'm here and I'm doing this. So I found that absolutely fascinating. So whilst I was doing the drawing of it, I was thinking about her with her chisel, possibly crying. Who knows? Could you cry for the whole length of time it took to make that? So yeah, I am fascinated by the amount of emotion that gets somehow swept up in material processes.
You were capturing that emotion, but in a drawing or a painting of a work seen in a photograph in many of the cases by someone from this circle. So I mean,
no, it is. That's exactly it. There's a whole series of translations. So if you think materially, you've got someone in front of you, possibly. Sometimes it's from the imagination, but possibly you've got this person there that's then being translated into clay, say, for example, and then I'm seeing it as an archival photograph, but then I'm taking a photo on my phone. And then I'm painting the photograph on my phone and I'm stretching the pixels out as much as I can. But I know that I've just got a surface, just a flat screen surface. But I'm trying to translate that into a brush mark on a different kind of surface. So I feel like I'm really interested in the slippage between all of those material states. And what gets lost when in that translation. And I suppose also what is gained. But I tend to think of it as lost, because I do tend to think of that original encounter as being the primary one, which is probably a little old-fashioned of me. But in some ways, you know, I also see the painting that we've arrived at through all these translations as a kind of composite of them all as well. So it's both a loss and a gain, yeah.
It's definitely a gain if you're kind of imagining and filling in the gaps and re-imbuing a kind of sense of aliveness to that face. Yeah. You also have these beautiful hands, which are going to be on show as well.
Yeah.
Can you say a little about them? I mean, obviously I know Rodin did beautiful hands, Claudel did beautiful hands. Yes,
and Claudel and Lipscomb and Golubkina and Ottilie McLaren Wallace made hands for Rodin. Right. So that was one of their jobs. I did a residency in Oxford and I went into the basement at the Ashmolean, and when they opened a drawer I saw this little hand and it had a little label on it. It's a bronze hand and it said after Rodin on it. And later, when I was here in the library, I found a photograph of a hand that looked almost exactly the same in a catalogue by Camille Claudel. So I did wonder if after Rodin was actually Claudel. It's not completely the same. There's a thumb that's turning one way, not the other. But anyway, in my imagination, I got to thinking about this hand as being not the work of Rodin, but by the work of one of his practicians. And so originally I thought, well, it would be nice to have it in the show. And then with, all the borrowing and stuff, it gets quite complex. So instead I asked whether I could 3D scan it. So we helpfully enlisted Scan the World, who came to the Ashmolean and scanned the hand. Then we got it 3D printed. So now I've got these different versions. This one's resin, this one's plastic, but I've painted it to look like plaster. And this one is a porcelain cast from the 3D scan. And so now I've got lots of different versions of this hand, and they're all slightly different. They're all made of different substances. So this idea of the material translation has sort of come through here. They say to painters that hands are the most difficult things to paint, but I think it's probably true for sculpture as well. And so there's this idea that you'll be practicing to make the hand and you just keep making it. And obviously Rodin's studio had drawers full of fragments, which you can see in archival photographs. So for me, this sense of this hand, which may or may not be by one of the women in the show, it almost doesn't have to be, because it's the idea of it, I think, is present.
Absolutely, and it fits in with the idea of translation and sort of speaking, in the sense that for these artists, and you, hands are kind of the means to communicating. Absolutely,
yes. I mean, the notion of the gesture, which is kind of what I was talking a little bit about when you're making the paintings, and you're trying to use the gesture of the paintbrush to enliven the face. This is by Meta Vaux Warrick Fuller, who's an artist that I came across right at the beginning of my research and then forgot about, and then someone mentioned her to me later, and I took a renewed interest. Absolutely fascinating artist who came to Paris, encountered racism on her entry to Paris. She was turned away from the American Women Artists Club where she'd booked in to stay. Saw Rodin, had some advice from Rodin. Rodin apparently, thought that she was very good, and then went back to the States and was part of the Harlem Renaissance. So, as someone said to me, you don't expect Rodin and the Harlem Renaissance to come together, but actually in this artist's life they did. She was also a theatre designer, she was a poet, so she was a really important final addition to this series of drawings.